Welcome, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on reforming Venezuela's oil and gas sector, which presents and discusses a new paper just published by Chatham House that focuses on Venezuela's reform. And we will have I think, a very dynamic discussion around this topic today. This is a project that is the culmination of a series of workshops and discussions and iterations to arrive at this point. And we're very pleased to have this discussion with you all. I should note that this is a session that is on the record, so it is not under Chatham House rule. We're really here to discuss the way out of a situation in which Venezuela has found itself where there's been a drastic decline in oil production since the 2000s, and reversing the fortunes of the Venezuelan oil sector is going to demand strengthening of existing institutional frameworks, policy frameworks, new licensing terms. But as the report states, it's also critical to set this oil expansion within a comprehensive energy plan for the country. And I think that's a critical point that the report makes. So in addition to that, we'll also look at environmental goals in this context and strengthening governance. So it's interesting, we're having this discussion on the way out, the way to rebuild the sector without having great clarity on the future political system that will characterize Venezuela in the next years. We're also in a context of great economic uncertainty related to COVID, great market uncertainty related to the energy transition. But the report sets out, I think, some avenues for a stronger Venezuela within this uncertainty. And so I think we're well positioned to be able to speak about something concrete despite all those unknowns that we don't know. So I think without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who will sort of set the scene, who is Nick Norton, Senior Energy Advisor at the FCDO. And we also like to take this opportunity to thank the FCDO for its collaboration on this project. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks very much, Valerie. To start with, if I may, a little bit of context. So in March 2020, Chatham House, with FCDO support, hosted an invitee-only conference on rebuilding Venezuela's energy sector. When planning that event, little did we all know that we were all about to become pioneers in using a tool that most of us didn't know about then, but we're all users of now. Of course, that is Zoom. So that was a kind of a real learning experience. But I'm happy to say that the conference was a great success, with excellent support from Chatham House, and along with a highly engaged group of attendees. This was followed up by a workshop in November 2020. The purpose of both events was to promote a dialogue on what a sustainable future for the Venezuelan energy industry might look like, specifically the oil and gas sectors. I'd like to thank Chatham House, and particularly Chris Sabatini, Courtney Rice, and Anna Butter, for their highly professional advice and successful implementation of both events, together with the team from the British Embassy in Caracas. And of course, we had a number of independent reviewers of the paper, who made a very significant contribution to developing the paper that we're going to talk about today. The paper that we're discussing, of course, is reforming Venezuela's oil and gas sector, and it's a public contribution to this important dialogue. I'd like to thank Igor and Jose for their deep expertise they brought to this topic. The intent is not to prescribe answers, but to promote a dialogue on this topic, particularly respect to international competition for investment dollars. I think that's a kind of key theme. A sister paper on revitalizing the power sector is currently in preparation. Of course, the last 18 months have been highly eventful for the global energy industry. In part, that has been because of the pandemic shock to both demand and to the oil price. However, there's also a kind of growing realization that the energy transition has arrived, and it's highly relevant for investment decisions that are going to be made now in the near future. There will be no going back to the good old days, and quite frankly, they were not that good anyway. So investment decisions that are taken in the near future are going to have to take into account the fact that the energy transition has arrived. We don't know when peak oil demand will arrive, but I think it will likely arrive within the time frame of projects that will be sanctioned now and in the near future. When the political conditions allow, humanitarian relief and economic recovery will be critically dependent on the power and the oil and gas sectors. These sectors are closely linked, and developing policies that are consistent with the energy transition and the need to diversify the economy, especially in the post-pandemic context, will be very important. However, when considering this and economic recovery and diversification, there will be many calls on government and development bank financing. Realistically, that means that investment in the oil and gas sector is likely to need to come from international companies, either IOCs or national oil companies. And also, the Venezuelan government will need fiscal revenues in order to implement economic recovery and diversification. Different companies will have different political and economic risk appetites, but all have alternative opportunities around the globe. And that really is at the core of this paper, comparing the other alternative opportunities that companies have. Also, for many companies, issues like flaring reductions and emissions intensity of production will be important given their public commitment to the energy transition. This excellent paper is an important contribution to the dialogue on the future fiscal, regulatory and investment framework for Venezuela, with comparisons with countries that are likely to be Venezuela's competitors. This is not, of course, the final word on this, and ongoing dialogue on Venezuela's economic recovery and the future of the oil and gas industry merits further attention and discussion. With that, I would like to hand over to Jose and Igor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Yes, so we'll hear now from the two authors of the report, Igor Hernandez and Jose La Rosa Reyes. And after that, we'll hear from two respondents, Luisa Palacios and Andres Rosenthal. So just to start us off, please, Igor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you, Nick, for your kind comment. Yeah, no problem. So as I load just one couple of slides, I just want to mention first that I want to thank Chatham House for all the support throughout this project and all the help that Chris and Courtney and Anna they all have provided to this report. And I also want to thank the FCDO for all the comments and the advice throughout this last year. So we want to share very briefly just a few slides presenting the report that we just published. And for the sake of time, I don't want to go into the entire description of the report, but I do want to present a few points that I think will be useful for the upcoming question and answer sessions. So the first point I want to say is that Venezuela's oil and gas industry, as it is right now, does face tremendous challenges to attract those international dollars of investments that Nick just mentioned a minute ago. And when we go through the Venezuela's oil and gas industry right now, what we see is that in terms of institutional quality, Venezuela is in the rock bottom of basically almost any indicator that you can find, analyzing issues such as government effectiveness, rule of law, accountability, and that creates a very unstable environment for long-term investments, such as the ones that we're talking about when we talk about oil and gas. We also find that the Venezuela's legal regime right now is very rigid and it only allows for joint ventures for international investors to go into the country, and they can only participate as minority partners, which means that it is the government that has to carry the biggest burden in terms of investments, and it is also the government that makes most of the decisions in the projects. And also in terms of fiscal regime, we also find that Venezuela has a really high government take, and that reduces the incentives for investors to come into the country. So looking at those issues, which are only three of all the several issues that we are analyzing in the paper, but I think are the most important or the most relevant, we wanted to take a look at how the Draft Hydrocarbons Bill addresses those elements. And to answer the question, is this enough to generate interest from investors? And the answer that we have, and that is the second point here, that is a qualified yes. The law does make really significant inroads in terms of reforming the sector governance by creating this independent regulator, the Agencia Venezolana de Hidrocarburos, which is the name in Spanish, the Venezuelan Hydrocarbons Agency, that will separate the policy and political decisions in the sector from the technical and operating decisions and allow for companies to operate freely in the oil and gas sector. In terms of contractual regime, we see that the law basically would allow for almost any type of contract that we have seen across the world to be implemented in the country, and that the main benefit of that is that it allows for many more business models and different kinds of projects to be developed in the future. And the qualified part of that answer, I think I will reserve that to the fiscal reforms, which, yes, we see a very important change in terms of simplifying the very convoluted tax regime that Venezuela has right now, with a royalty plus an extraction tax, plus additional taxes, plus a windfall profit tax, plus an income tax, and so on, and try to streamline it to a much more simple structure. But we do mention in the paper that there's one potential concern that we have in terms of that the royalty rate that's going to be paid by operators is still relatively, it could be lower, or it could still at 16% is not as competitive as other countries. And also it is fixed, which may generate a problem in terms of creating a regressive tax regime in which, as profits go up, the profits of the projects go up, the government can capture a lower share of that rent, and that can generate some problems in the long term in terms of stability for those contracts. So the third point I wanted to mention is that in the paper we analyzed the bill that is proposed, but there's one point that we kind of want to highlight, and this can be a long discussion, and so we leave it for the Q&A session. But basically, we want to highlight that there are still very significant political risks that can hamper the reform effort that we're seeing with this bill. And in the short term, just to mention that the big problem that we see right now in the short term is that this bill was designed to be implemented following a political transition to a democratic government. And we have not seen that yet, sadly, and we don't know when or if we will see that. So that generates a lot of uncertainty of when can we expect this bill to be implemented. And thinking of the longer term, and once we can define a scenario in which this bill is implemented and this reform advances, I just want to mention one quick point. A couple of weeks ago, at a public presentation about this law, one of the main advisors behind this bill, he very openly said that they had discussed this project with all political factors in the country, except for Chavismo. And I don't know if we can assume that that Chavismo will not be a political factor in the future, but that's just generates one question in terms of how in the future will that political sector will take this law, and whether they will play along with this law or if they will try to overrule that. So that's just to mention that uncertainty in the long term in terms of how politically this bill will be implemented. So just wanted to mention these few points. We'd be happy to discuss this and any other issue in the Q&A session, and I will leave you with Igor to continue.
Thank you, Jose. What I will say first is that we need to point out that this research, and the international comparison focus on a specific fiscal, contractual, and institutional aspects of the proposed hydrocarbons bill, as it took most of the discussion in Venezuela, given their impact on upstream and downstream activities. While we acknowledge the limited scope of the analysis, it is also true that the extent of the needed reforms goes beyond legal or institutional changes, something that we point in the final sections of the paper. It is important to understand that future reforms should have in mind a comprehensive energy policy, able to change the view of the hydrocarbon sector from an opportunity to generate rents into an industry that creates value and supports other sectors in the economy. For example, by allowing access to energy in a safe, sustainable, and competitive way. Among other efforts, feeding plans for the hydrocarbon sector in a broader energy policy requires an increased interest in the role of natural gas and the development of more infrastructure for higher utilization and reduced flare. But it enters a larger discussion on design issues for domestic energy markets and energy subsidy reform. Subsidies in Venezuela are really large, estimated between 15 and 20 billion a year, according to the latest estimations, that are also properly priced investment risk, but also allowed to price the resource base in the country. A second point that has taken larger relevance are the environmental, social, and governance issues and how they have affected investors' perception towards the sector. Among other implications, these issues effectively raise the cost of capital for oil and gas projects. But for Venezuela, point to very specific questions on the environmental liabilities created by PDVSA, issues of lack of transparency and corruption, and the management of oil ventures going forward, just to name a few. Other questions relate to the management of future oil and gas revenues, as the country not only remains exposed to the volatility of oil prices, but has suffered from the discretionality in the use of oil rights. And there is a concern that an increased activity and revenues could represent another wasted opportunity and raises the temptation of future governments to revise contracts along the way. We think that beyond formal rules in place, the challenge for Venezuela is one of implementation under a very uncertain environment. So that means that legal reforms are necessary, but not sufficient. As recent experience has shown, one of the biggest concerns in the country is the absence of rule of law and the disintegration of state capabilities to honor contracts, respect property rights, or increase investor confidence overall. There is a reputational burden from expropriation processes and the mismanagement of the oil industry in the country that has increased risk perception, and this is not something that can be fixed with just legal reforms. On one hand, we think that Nicolás Maduro staying in power effectively blocks any prospect for meaningful investment in the country, despite repeated attempts in recent years to attract private investment, including their own opaque reforms coming from the anti-blockade law and their own draft of the Hydrocarbons Bill. On the other hand, we don't know the type of political transition that could take place in Venezuela. the resulting balance of power, and whether this will be enough to achieve stability. We also point to other issues that play a role in the aftermath of a political transition, if it happens, concerning operational issues, what will happen with economic sanctions, pending legal processes against the country, human capital constraints, the role of incumbent companies, economic policy decisions overall, security, and others. We also want to point that even though there could be companies willing to navigate some of these risks, we also need to put these reform efforts against changes taking place in energy markets, which impose more competition to attract investment and increase concerns about the timing of peak oil demand. This will not only affect the type of players entering the country, but also the type of projects that they will be looking at. And in some cases, they will be looking at the country's overall strategy towards the sector beyond any post-tax metrics, for instance. This environment also imposes several tasks on Venezuela, not only in terms of a balance between predictability in contractor conditions and flexibility to respond to changing markets, but also what will be the strategy and factors that enable other value drivers for the sector as the energy transition unfolds. For example, how to reduce carbon footprint from the activities, the use of hydrocarbons as feedstock, or different capabilities for the service sector. But to even think about that requires to meet minimum conditions of property rights, integration between R&D sectors, government and companies, and a broad political consensus, again, as Jose said, to support this act. To conclude, we think that while the proposed changes aim at supporting further reform efforts and remove some constraints to investment and operation in the future, much remains to be seen in terms of a holistic approach to our reform. And not having a political transition in place creates much uncertainty regarding how any of these changes will be implemented in a country with a recent history of its management. We want to thank for your attention. We want to thank Chatham House and FCDO, particularly to Chris, Courtney, and Anna, and the team that supported us along the project. You have our contact information and the link to the report in the Chatham House page, and we look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, thanks both very much. There's a lot more to say about this report, so I really encourage all the participants to just read it, and it covers a lot of ground in very clear and succinct way, and I think it's really a good contribution to our thinking about Venezuela's oil sector in the future. So I'd like to turn to Dr. Luisa Palacios, who is a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, to give us her thoughts on the paper, and we'll see what points she wants to pick up.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Chatham House, for the honor of being able to discuss such a fantastic paper, Jose and Igor. I really, really liked it. I thought it was very valuable, not only in terms of highlighting the benefits of the reform, but in my view, I think the most value added comes from the analysis of the shortcomings and the challenges that the energy reform will face, and which you have very eloquently explained today. I want to go back to something that Dr. Norton said, that we have to understand that any energy reform that takes place in Venezuela is going to take place in the context of a changing energy market. In that sense, I want to highlight 3 points that you guys make already, which I think are key. The first one is about the role of the national oil company in any future oil industry in Venezuela. I think you're correct to point out that this is I don't know if a weakness, but a level of or an element of uncertainty that the energy reform, proposed energy bill has, that can make or break whether this reform is successful or not. And as you have defined it, the metric to evaluate whether this reform is successful or not is if it's going to be able to attract the significant FDI and financing that you yourselves have identified in the paper. And I think you make a very compelling case that the reason why this is so relevant to define the role of the national oil company in that new oil industry has to do with the financial distress in which the national oil company finds itself. It has to do with the technical and operational weaknesses, to be elegant, of the current national oil company, which makes it completely ill prepared to lead this effort. And I think bringing the comparative framework, I think Mexico is a case at hand of that the role of the dominant role of the national oil company in an energy reform can hinder its ability to attract foreign direct investment and therefore to increase oil production. I would say that to me, that's not the only thing. I sincerely think that one of the other issues of why there needs to be a redefinition of the national company PDVSA in a future oil industry has to do with compliance risks, which you point out, by the way, Igor, on your analysis of ESG. I cannot stress enough the importance of this energy of ESG, environmental, social responsibility, and governance, and how it affects financing, access to capital, access to foreign direct investment. It's a huge challenge for Venezuela. I do think, and you correctly point out, that this energy reform proposal thus is a step in the right direction. It establishes a clear institutional body like the Independent Regulatory Agency. It eliminates the monopoly position, at least on paper, of the national oil company. It opens options following an open and competitive process. All of these are important steps in the right direction in terms of governance. But from the limited experience that I have on this, these legacy issues are going to weigh on Venezuela for some time. It's not just a change of government that it's going to make them go away. I think there has to be a recognition of the significant work that needs to take place on issues of transparency, on issues of institutional building, on issues of anti-corruption, on issues of corporate governance and respect for contracts. These are legacy issues that need to be addressed in order also for the whatever proposed bill for its success. The third point that I want to make is one that Igor also raised and was raised by Valerie, was raised by Dr. Norton, which is the idea that whatever oil and gas hydrocarbon bill has to be encompassed in a national energy agenda, given the issues that we just discussed about energy transition. So I do think that the bill, and I read it, does recognize and acknowledges some of these changes taking place in the energy industry, but I don't think there's sufficient thought about how to fit this energy or oil and gas bill within that strategy. And I don't think this is something that can be ignored, in part because, yes, what we are discussing, that the oil and gas countries or producer countries are facing increased competition from each other. And the reform is a step in the right direction at simplifying the contractual and providing more flexibility on contracts on the fiscal side. In reality, oil and gas producing countries are competing also with completely different sources of energy. And so you're not only competing with each other, you're competing with completely different sources of energy. And so the things that matter are much less about resource base and how much oil you have or how much gas and for how many years, because we are in a world of stranded assets. So in my view, I think the next part of this agenda, which can be as difficult for Venezuela, is the understanding that oil producing countries in this new environment are also going to compete in terms of who can make greener oil production. And when I see the Canadian oil sand producers announcing that they are going to invest to reduce greenhouse emissions so that they're net zero by 2050, I think Venezuela has to pay really good attention to that, because I think that the next phase, or I suspect that the next phase in this agenda is border carbon taxes, tariffs that could come from not only, so we're seeing the pressures from the financial side, we have yet to see the pressures from the consumer market side. And these are also going to differentiate the winners and losers within the oil and gas space, which will continue to be a source of energy. And what the defining variable could very well be who's greener and who's not. And with that, let me just stop here.
Thanks, Luisa. That gave us a lot of fodder for the discussion after. That was perfect. Ambassador Rosenthal, may I turn to you? You hold the lifetime rank of Eminent Ambassador of Mexico, and we're very pleased to have you. If you can make your response to the paper.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and many thanks to Chatham House for inviting me to make some comments. on this wonderful and very timely study that Igor and Jose have finalized and that is now published and available. I think there are lots of similarities between some of the conclusions that the paper makes regarding Venezuela with my own country, Mexico. Not everything is exactly the same. We went through our reform process, constitutional reform process, some years ago, with the expectation that the opening up of a hitherto closed energy sector to private, both foreign and domestic investment would bring Mexico back into what I could call the big leagues of hydrocarbon production and renewable energy generation in the electricity sector. And things were going quite well. I must say there were many criticisms of the reform process. There were issues relating to the regulatory agencies that were set up. But towards the end of the Peña Nieto administration, up until 2018, we received and had several important new investments in the energy sector, in addition to Pemex, the state oil company, being able to reserve in round zero a large number of blocks and possibilities in the Gulf of Mexico. The Mexican Council on Foreign Relations played a rather important role during the discussion and debate on the energy reform, having prepared 4 white papers similar to what now Igor and Jose have prepared for Venezuela. And a lot of that was picked up as public policy eventually in the legislation that went forward, especially the constitutional reform in Mexico. I think one of the clear changes that took place with the arrival of the López Obrador administration and the obstacles that he and his government have put on private sector investment in the oil and gas sector and electricity sector, for that matter, are due to issues which are mainly ideological and which mainly relate to the lack of understanding that the changes in the oil and gas sector have taken place since Mr. López Obrador and many of his cohorts were campaigning against the energy reforms that over a period of about 30 years, different administrations in Mexico tried to put forward. And that is fundamentally there are fundamentally 2 issues. One, of course, is scarcity versus abundance, and the other is the issue of environmental sustainability. And what López Obrador has done in the first 3 years of his administration is to make life very difficult for the oil and gas sector in terms of the private investment, and trying to revert back to the monopoly that Pemex and CFE in the electricity sector had prior to the energy reform. Now, in order to do that, the Constitution needs to be amended. And he tried to do this through executive orders during the first half of his administration, all of which have been suspended by the judiciary in Mexico as presumably being unconstitutional. And this relates to the new oil and gas hydrocarbon law that he tried to put through and that has been suspended, as well as a couple of other energy sector related issues. Now, he, I think, was expecting, after our midterm elections 2 weeks ago, to be able to have a sufficient majority in the Congress, which is a 2/3 majority, a qualified majority, to be able to pass constitutional reforms in the energy sector and thus cancel out the judiciary suspensions that have taken place of the proposed laws that in the first half of his administration he put forward. You all know that the election results were unfavorable to López Obrador and his movement in the Chamber of Deputies, in the lower house of Congress. And now Morena does not even have a simple majority. And in order to get a simple majority for changing certain laws and passing the budget and so on, he will have to negotiate with some of the other political parties in the Congress in order to get a simple majority. But what is clear is that it is almost impossible for him to get a qualified majority in order to revert the constitutional reforms that were passed during the Peña Nieto administration. So when looking at Venezuela, of course, and this reform that is being discussed, I think one of the key issues should be to find ways in which whatever reforms and whatever institutions are set up to work under the reforms are more stable and more set in concrete, if you like, than what we were able to do in Mexico. Because it's clear that political changes on what is fundamentally a very highly politicized issue in many countries, certainly in Venezuela and in Mexico, need to be blindados, need to be armored against political ups and downs and changes in government, as we've seen in the case of Mexico. I mean, just a simple change of government has turned the energy reform in Mexico pretty much upside down. Now, most of the existing contracts that were signed during the bidding rounds during the past administration are still in effect and have been respected. López Obrador said he was going to look into corruption issues and that he was going to try to see whether these contracts were awarded under strange, as he called it, circumstances. But so far, nothing has been found, and the contracts continue to be working. What isn't working is the regulatory scheme. The regulatory agencies have been emasculated. They've been either weakened or they have been members of the regulatory commissions have been removed and replaced by people who are sympathetic to López Obrador's ideology. And so we have huge backlogs regarding permit requests for different aspects of the energy reform, because both the CRE, the Comisión Reguladora Energética, and the National Hydrocarbons Commission have been basically slowing down or even stopping many of the permissions and permits that need to be approved for new things to happen. So that would be my comment. I think that Venezuela needs to look carefully at the Mexican example and find ways to make sure, or try to make sure, that whatever reforms go forward and whatever institutions are set up to regulate those reforms have a better foundation, if you like, than was the case in Mexico.
Thank you very much. That's maybe we could build on this theme a little bit before, because I'd like to go back to the transition points that Luisa was making. But I also thought in reading the paper, it was really valuable to go back to that comparative perspective on why reform was successful or not in different countries. And the paper looks at Iraq, Brazil, Mexico, and Nigeria. So what do you think would be the lessons learned for Venezuela in terms of the elements that can build consensus? Because you talk about the need for consensus. So what could be, sticking points in Venezuela? Would it be subsidies? You talked about the need to reform the subsidy system. The role of PDVSA, speaking to Luisa's point, would that be a very contentious element of a reform? And what would be easy wins that could build popular support for reform? It seems like a low-hanging fruit would be eliminating flaring and fugitive emissions, something that could be win-win, low cost, and generally successful. But there may be other similar sort of ingredients of success for a reform to stick. And I want to just point to a comment made in the Q&A by Luisa Pacheco, who also talks about the politics as usual can be an obstacle to a reform process because there's vested interests from benefiting from distribution of wealth. So once a new administration is in place, what would there really be a continued interest in a reform process if it challenges a revenue base? So if you want to respond to some of these themes, you pick which you'd like to talk about. Yes, Igor.
I'll give it a try, but let me see if I can connect with some of what Ambassador Rosenthal also said about having the reforms locked somehow. And I think the key word in all of that, with the question from Luis Pacheco and the other questions are, it's a matter of accountability. So it's not, Venezuela has a long history of discretionary management of oil rights. And that translates into for instance, high fuel subsidies. When we think about the question for flaring, for instance, developing infrastructure for flaring usually should come by PDVSA, or at least under the current law, but PDVSA doesn't have the financial muscle to do it. And if you want to attract private investment to do that, then you need the proper price to develop that infrastructure. And so if you want to develop the proper price, then you need to engage into a discussion on energy subsidy reform, which I think it gets sensitive somehow if you don't do it gradually, for instance, which has been some of what has been discussed. But more importantly, I think you need to balance access to energy. For instance, there is a large problem of a scarcity of cooking gas. There is a scarcity of gasoline, diesel, some other things. How do you balance that against probably increased prices for some of these fuels? I think that's a discussion that needs to take place probably in a political spectrum. But I also think that whatever revenues you get from the increased activity, there has been proposals from the stabilization funds and other things, but the implementation part of it, I think, is a big problem, because then you tend to have this temptation to get a little bit of these revenues or changing the rules along the way because you want to seize the opportunity, and there is something related to political cycles. If I want to get a better performance, then I might just change the law because I have a high discount rate. So I think, how do you handle that discussion? I think it comes down to how do you generate this accountability or measures or these instruments for that. And there has been proposals of reforming energy subsidies and transfer some of these prices directly to direct transfer to population. That some of this has been discussed already. But politically, I'm not sure if we have something concrete on that area. But that's just my piece of it. Sorry for the long answer.
Yeah, I agree with Igor that the sticking point of revenue management is going to be very tricky to pass through. And you can see that in the current version of the Hydrocarbons Bill, basically there's no mention of how that is going to be managed. It's just like the bill basically focuses on how to collect taxes and how to incentivize production, but doesn't really address us beyond some comments at the beginning of and in the preamble of the law, in terms of like policy objectives, in terms of saving that money or using the money to support the development of the country. But there's nothing really different in terms of how those resources are going to be managed. And I could bet that's just because it's so hard to pass through that point in a country that has a system in which whoever manages the rent basically has unlimited political power in the country, or at least domestically. But I do want to mention something that we can see in other countries that also had similar perspective. And I want to go back to the comment of Ambassador Rosenthal in terms of how the reform was, the Mexican reform was thought, and how it was slowly implemented after several years of efforts to do so. It managed to be passed at a point in which the economic system for collecting rents was at a breaking point. It wasn't a point in which people from all political sides can say, yeah, this is no longer working. And there's an opportunity if we can agree to reform this and have this phrase that many times we use, a bigger share of the cake in terms of oil revenues. So I think paradoxically, right now in Venezuela would be the good moment to see that, seeing the collapse that we have had in terms of production, in terms of revenues that go into the government. It just happens that the country right now is in a very complicated political crisis that makes that kind of negotiation and dialogue much harder. But you can see even from the Chavismo side and from the government, the de facto government of Venezuela, you see that they are also concerned about how do we now bring investors that we were kicking away a couple of years ago, and there are very different, or at least based on what we know, very different ways to do so. Comparing this proposal of the bill and the action that the de facto government is taking. But the essential need is there. Both sides can recognize we need investors to come here and fix this problem. So I think any effort to reach a consensus has to start there.
Thanks. Luisa, I think you wanted to respond on this.
I wanted to build on the comment because I do think, I wish that the authors had taken the comparative framework a little bit further. Your question about lessons learned, I think that all the elements are there, but in the presentation, I wish that Igor and Jose would have put the very impressive graph where it shows the trajectory of oil production of the different countries that they're discussing, because it does show Mexico and the fact that you left such a dominant position of the national company in the oil industry had consequences, and those consequences were in relation to oil production. So I think that what I would do and what I would suggest the authors do is first try to bring more the lessons learned. Second, I think you started to build metrics. So what it represents to be a successful oil reform. And it is implicit in your report that oil production is one of them. And you believe that oil production, in the case of Venezuela, because of the dire situation of the national company, therefore, in order to measure success of the oil reform, you will need to attract significant FDI, or significant levels of foreign investment. So you give a link between the two. But I have to say that, for example, the case of Brazil is a very different case. The case of Brazil, and why Brazil is now the largest oil producer and the largest oil exporter in Latin America, has to do with the capacity of Petrobras in financial terms and in execution and technological and technical capacity. So the starting point of the national company, and research that I've done before, explains a lot how the success of oil reforms. So in my view, the case to me that seemed to suggest lessons learned more than any other cases is Mexico on the downside, but Iraq on the upside. So if I were to think about a country that could, relate to what Venezuela is looking at, is Iraq. And I think you make a very compelling case that the open auctions, competitive open auctions, transparent open auctions in Iraq were the success to its oil production increase. But in general, I will invite you to look at metrics, not only about oil production growth, about oil FDI, but also about fiscal revenues. Because I do think that in thinking about what Ambassador Rosenthal is saying on the need to show that the oil reform worked fast, I think the way the Mexicans thought about this was more on the back end, the benefits of the oil reform. We're going to see them more at the back end. In the case of Brazil, the auctions is a way to raise fiscal revenues very fast, and so I would just look at each of these cases and look at the metrics and look at how much oil FDI, how much oil fiscal revenues, what were the links of the effects on the local economy, things that you have mentioned that are the metrics of whether an oil reform is successful or not. I think that, in my view, will provide an interesting framework that can inform policymakers in Venezuela about the cost and benefits of the decisions that they're taking.
Thanks, Luisa. I think before I turn to Nick and Andres to respond, I wanted to just build a little bit on what you were saying and tie it back to your comments initially about being prepared for the energy transition. It occurs to me that in the report, you do this comparison of how well the different countries have fared as, to draw lessons for Venezuela. And as you're describing, it could be done more comprehensively. But I think what would be really important is to think about how Venezuela and those other countries, drawing lessons from how those other countries are prepared for the energy transition. And so how they've done up till now is not really going to inform us on how they're going to do in the future. How well they can tackle ESG concerns. For Iraq, that's been a really big issue. But then we see the new deal they have with Total tying into desalinization and electricity generation, solar power generation. And then Canada, sorry, I forgot to mention that's one of the cases. Canada's exports routes are really challenged because of the carbon intensity. And going back to Luisa's point on the rising specter of EU carbon border tax adjustments, it's going to be very challenging for producers like Venezuela to avoid carbon taxation as that starts to expand. So I think it seems like a narrative for the transition is going to have to be a really important part of rebuilding the sector. Sorry, I'll turn to Nick.
Thank you. I was just going to, one of the points I was going to make is already in part been made by Luisa, but I was going to comment on the importance of auctions, because I think as well as being very good for transparency, that, it kind of gets around the problem of, backroom negotiations between, let's face it, very well prepared and, very expertly advised by lawyers at oil companies and relatively unprepared regulators. The other thing that it's quite important for is this point about discovering the risk appetite, because different companies will have different risk appetites, and one of the key ways of discovering that is through an auction process. And Iraq, that's one of the kind of breakthroughs that Iraq had in its early days. You can criticize, some of the kind of the later policies, but initially, one of the key things they did was have a set of auctions that really discovered who had the appetite to enter the country and get on with producing oil. The other thing, with the experience from Iraq was that they allowed consortia to be formed. So again, different companies bring different capabilities and different risk appetite. So for example, an IOC may bring all sorts of technical capabilities, but an NOC may bring certain risk appetite, political risk appetite. And one of the things that Iraq did was allow consortia to be formed so that different companies could bring different appetites for risk and allow the kind of the auction process to proceed.
Valerie, if you allow me to make a very quick comment, because unfortunately I have to drop off on the hour, to what Luisa said. There are two issues. One, of course, is the fiscal revenue that arises out of these auction processes, and the other is the production increase. And what happened in the case of Mexico is we had no problem with the fiscal revenue, but the exaggerated claims that we would be increasing production very quickly, additional barrels under the Peña Nieto administration, was in effect totally unrealistic, given that many of the projects that were bid out had anywhere between a 3 to 10 year time frame. And it was clear that there would be very few, if any, additional barrels during the Peña Nieto administration. And that is one of the things that López Obrador has hung his hat on by saying, oh, well, beautiful energy reform, where are the additional barrels? We don't have them. And it's true, we don't. Pemex has been able to increase its production by maybe close to 100,000 barrels in the past 8 years, 7 years. And most of these projects, as they will come on stream, will do so, especially in deep water, will do so in the next, at the end of this administration or in the next administration. So I think that's something that has to be taken into account. Thank you to you, Valerie, and to the panelists and the authors. I'm sorry I have to drop off, but I have another comment on another study to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Jose, Igor, would you like to respond to some of the comments made this far?
Yeah, so on the comment on in terms of the energy transition and how energy transition, as it was just as if it was only one thing impacting the country, I think, yeah, we kind of hint that in the report in terms of how Venezuela will need to completely change the way it sees the development of the oil, because so far the country is still rooted in that vision that you can build the country if you can just produce enough oil to generate enough oil rents to pay for enough development in the country, and then everything will be fine. And that narrative that even if you could argue that at some point it was true historically, no longer, I believe it no longer has any value moving forward. This is not to say that oil will not be important or will not be demanded by the world in the future. I mean, you could see that there are many different uses for oil that even into a spectrum of 30 or 40 years there will still be demand. I think the main point I want to make is that the economic concept of the oil rent driving development in the country is something that we should have already overcome by now. And I am not sure that is the case. So thinking of a transition to renewable energy sources that can challenge the position of oil in the world market, I think that will present a big challenge to Venezuela, because on one side, we will see some impact over demand in the long term. How much is it going to be? I don't know. I think at this point, not many people know. We can estimate, we can make scenarios and assumptions, but we don't know how quickly that transition will be. And so with less space for demand, there's a challenge for Venezuela because the country will need to compete even more to attract whatever investment is going to be available. And also, if the oil demand starts to fall in the future, whenever that happens, I think that also presents a challenge for Venezuela on the side of fiscal revenues. If the country will still depend on oil rents and demand is going to be lower, that economic rent will potentially be lower. So there's less space for the country to use the level of oil development and oil rents to support the country. So yeah, it is a huge challenge, and I don't know if the country has had that dialogue domestically to say how do we face this? How do we deal with that? And I say that, well, I mean, it's sad to say that, but I think many people are still just thinking of how much oil can we produce and export. That's kind of the key variable that many people still have on their minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of focus still on that, especially with the need to the really acute development needs that the focus will be on the oil rent. Igor, before I turn to you, I mean, some of the questions that we've gotten in the Q&A related to that is Adedapo Aladesani asking about, we're talking about how to increase incentives to attract investment, but what about the benefits for Venezuelans? How can we ensure they benefit? And also, someone wanted to know how the current proposal, the plan-based reform proposal, compares to the Chavismo bill that was proposed. So if you could just give some comments on that. And then another point, so if you're taking notes, to the other one is, how much would it cost, from Juan Cordova, how much would it cost to establish this new Venezuelan hydrocarbon agency? From his experience, there's red tape, duplicity of functions, and complexity in relocating staff. Would that be something that would really, hinder the establishment of a new regulatory authority? And what's the cost-benefit analysis? So 3 kind of quite different points, but maybe one of you can comment on, pick up the ones I'm interested in.
I'll start with the last question from Joan. I think as per numbers, there hasn't been like a proper an estimation. I will refer to a work from the International Development Bank, Carlos Sucre and Luisa Palacios. They did some study on what would an agency for hydrocarbons would look like. And basically one of the questions is like, what will be the staffing and what's the role between the National Assembly and the supervision and the relationship with this new agency. I think that's an open question. Also because, as Luisa mentioned, the situation with PDVSA, you cannot compare it with Petrobras. So that you cannot, and there has been a recognition that you cannot rely on PDVSA to carry the burden of the investment policy. So what will happen for the long term with PDVSA, if this will migrate to somehow, if the people will migrate somehow to staff the agency, that will be a question that remains to be seen, for instance, but that's not explicit in the law. I would also say regarding the question, but yeah, there's something, the estimation needs to be seen, but I think there's some risk for overlapping between institutions, particularly the ministry. I think it's something we point out in the report also, between the ministry and the agency and the role of the National Assembly. Still think that like when deciding these auction processes, implementation, we need to see it. So what will happen? And as for the how people will benefit, that's the proverbial question. That's the lingering question that every politician may have. And particularly now with this discussion on how to diversify the economy. That has been a question that has lingered in Venezuela. And now with the energy transition, what will be the new sources of revenue, and well, how do you leverage from the old revenues use this for some other sectors. I think that has been tried in the past. This is not something that has been discussed just recently. This has been discussed over several years, and you can see over past administrations, there has been this need of diversifying the economy. But my concern is that this is usually led by state efforts. And in using this, there is a range for discretionality in the use of it. So you tend to favor through subsidies or some other things, some sectors that might not be competitive or doing things that not necessarily allow the economy to be in a long-run growth trend, let's say. And to me, that's part of the issue. How do we think about the hydrocarbon sector just beyond the use of these revenues and leverage for infrastructure and some other things, but think about providing access to energy for industrial sectors. So there is a steel making process. There are some other things that you can leverage on cheap energy, for instance, in Venezuela that could make it competitive. Or what would be the role of the petrochemical industry, or some other things that you can think for the economy as a whole. And to me, it seems that for the people, it translates into access to energy. I think that's the main thing that we don't see now. We see how important is energy when we don't have it. The other thing will be in terms of the multiplier effect that you have on these other industries in terms of employment. Like if you are competitive and you have cheap energy, you can employ more people. And finally, then you have to think about what's the use of, how do you use compensating mechanisms for people in terms of income? So if you're having a reform subsidy, is it possible to think about direct transfer to people? Is that a thing that could be helpful for people? And of course, this will be not meaningful quantities, but in some sense, get people involved into the discussion of what's happening with the oil industry. So, I mean, there are things that could be done, but I think they deserve a larger discussion, I would say.
Thanks, Igor. I wanted to pick up some questions from Francisco Monaldi. There's one actually for Luisa first, is what role, if any, could CITCO play in the recovery of the Venezuelan oil sector? And for Igor and Jose, can you comment on the fiscal framework that Venezuela should have and how auctions might play a role in defining the government take? So maybe Luisa first, if you want to talk about CITCO.
Thank you for the question. So the rationale for buying CITCO at the end of the 1980s, which is to have a market share in a very important consumer market for very heavy crude of Venezuela, to me now feels even more relevant in the context of the refinery industry in the US, moving to renewable fuels and the US market moving to EV. So it is if the oil and gas sector is going to have, in the best of cases, stagnated share of the energy matrix, but most likely it's going to have a reduction of that share. And the sources of transportation are also going to be diversified. There's going to be increased competition for placing crude in the consumer markets. And so that was the rationale to begin with, why PDVSA bought that refining arm, to me seems even more relevant in the context of the energy transition. The second point that I would mention is that Venezuela has one of the big issues that it's going to have to solve. So when we talk about the oil and gas reform, we're talking about the collapse of oil production, but really it's the collapse of the industry as a whole. And part of that is the downstream. And downstream is a very tricky business because it's a business of very low margins. Actually, the Latin American national oil companies have a dismay record on making refinery products profitable. They normally, it's a loss-making proposition for most of the national oil companies because this is an industry of very low margin. So you cannot really hide inefficiencies and corruption and other things. So I think one of the things that I've seen at CITCO is a significant expertise in producing, in processing heavy oil, very flexible. And in part, it has to do with the fact of where it's located, right? The US has very, very stringent regulations of all kinds, technical regulations, environmental regulations. And so that keeps everyone on check. I was reminded very recently that national oil companies probably have 10% of the US refining sector. So and so that's already very interesting to me, and it is a source of technological that is a source of technical expertise, and I would see CITGO perfectly being capable of helping in the recovery of the refining industry in Venezuela. And CITGO is already also learning a lot about how the refining industry can become also more green, and it's learning about carbon capture, it's learning about all the refinery sector in the US is learning about this. And so I think there's Venezuela is going to need a lot of expertise, and you have that expertise at CITGO. And lastly, you're going to need in the future, reliable fuels for Venezuela, and that's so the trade that existed of crude oil in exchange for petroleum products, I think continues to be a very valuable trade for the future reconstruction of the country.
Thanks, Luisa. Before I turn back to you, Jose, to give you, I think probably what'll be the last word, I want to sneak in a little additional question, which is that you've noted the colossal debt of the country and PDVSA. With that debt, does the sovereign wealth fund really make sense? Because it becomes, you don't make any money off of the sovereign wealth fund if you're paying back a debt at 9%. And then what about debt for climate swaps? That could be something really interesting for Venezuela to commit to climate projects in exchange for forgiveness of debt. And in its case, with the kind of repayment that you outlined in the paper, it's just at such a high level. But I think there was Francisco's question also on the fiscal terms with the auctions.
Yeah, thank you. So I will go quickly. So in terms of what would be the best fiscal regime for the country, I say that I think the key word would be flexibility. I mean, you cannot, or at least it is not efficient to have the same fiscal structure and the same tax rates for every different type of project that you have in the country. In Venezuela, a friend a couple of years ago has said this phrase that you have three different oil countries in Venezuela, oil and gas countries in Venezuela. You have the heavy oil resources, you have the brownfield light oil resources, and you have the offshore natural gas. And each of those three different kinds of projects needs a different fiscal regime. So I would focus on a flexible fiscal regime that allows the tax rates that are paid by each project to vary in terms of how many profits or how profitable they are. So the government can capture a larger rent when the projects are very profitable, but the investors can also have a break when oil prices go low or when the project is not as profitable. In the issue of auctions, I think we have kind of talked about that, how important they are. And Dr. Norton already mentioned how they're important for transparency, to avoid dark backroom deals that can lead to corruption, and also to give a better perspective of the value of the resources for investors, which if you do not have that reference, it's very easy that, or at least it's very likely that you will be entering into some bad deals at which 5 years later you will say, that was a bad deal, we have to renegotiate that. So that just keeps the spiral of renegotiation and instability that investors don't really like. And on the issue of the colossal debt, yeah, it's huge. And I know there was a framework that was already discussed for the ad hoc PDVSA administration and for the government of Venezuela to renegotiate all the sovereign debt with the PDVSA debt, because basically you need to address that renegotiation process at the same time. It's just too much, and PDVSA by itself cannot handle that level of debt. And Venezuela, maybe at some point we have to absorb that debt, but that has to be within a scheme of renegotiation with many bondholders and debtors, and with the support of international institutions to provide the support that Venezuela will need. And finally, on the issue of debt for climate, I think that would be an interesting. It would be a very good idea, but we will need to see what are the specific details. We don't want to get caught in any new fad or new buzzwords and really see what will be the value in there.
That's great. Thank you so much. You've covered so many issues, responded to so many questions. And I think I really want to thank you both for this wonderful report. I want to thank the organizers for this discussion and the series that preceded it, the funder, FCDO, and our respondents, Luisa, and the Ambassador Hernandez was here before. So sorry, Ambassador. So I want to thank everyone and just invite you all to read the report because it's really worth your while. Thanks.